I'm here as a, I guess, sort of a budget practitioner. And I will try to, I'm not going to try to use a one-word answer to the question, is state spending out of control? But I will try to get around to shedding some insights on the answer. And I'm going to try to do this quickly. I've got some notes here, but I probably won't have time to go through all of them. I'd like to talk a little bit about three things. First of all, Georgia's budget process and spending priorities. Second, talk a little bit about what in fact is a balanced budget. That seems to be not a subject of complete agreement. And third, I want to talk about some hidden trends in state spending that have been occurring over the past 20 years. First, on Georgia's budget process, I guess I have a little bit different perspective, having spent the better part of 16 years in the Office of Planning and Budget. I was part of a small team that was responsible for first fashioning the budget every year, shaping the spending plan, and then executing that spending plan after the legislature appropriates it. I've been out of government now for 7 or 8 years, and I've got a perspective a little bit different than a government insider. I've got more of a perspective as a business person, and I think I understand how people view their government better than I did back then. But based on that experience, I'd like to offer a few observations. Number one, I don't think there's anything wrong with Georgia's budget process per se. We have a very, very extensive, comprehensive, extremely thorough, bottoms-up budget process. It goes on all year long. It's conducted by a team of over 100 professionals. I think it's a process that a lot of states have, and compared to the Washington process, I think it's pretty good. Is state spending out of control? I think from a process standpoint, it's very much under control. You may not like the result, but as far as the process goes, I think it's first class. We've got a very conservative state legislature, and I think you can see from the actions that came out of this recent legislative session that they continue to be conservative. We saw, number one, a major tax cut, depending on whose numbers you accept, $240 million to $280 million a year. We saw a major cut to the educational bureaucracy, not as much as some would have liked, but we saw a major cut to the government bureaucracy. We saw a clear endorsement of the concept of privatization, particularly as it applies to prisons in the future. And finally, we saw a declaration by the governor that he would, quote unquote, sign any tax cut and veto any tax increase. Now, I think those four things are not exactly the actions of an out-of-control liberal legislative body. On the other hand, our process doesn't treat everyone the same. We have legislative insiders and legislative outsiders. But the changes that have started, the demographic and political changes that have started in the shift to a more conservative party affiliation, I think everybody expects those to continue over the next few years, but I don't think our conservative spending philosophy is going to change. Part of the problem, I think, comes from a definition of terms, and as we talk about the legislative or the budget process, you know, most people relate to the budget process based on what they read in the newspaper and hear in the news, and I think what the media almost always reports exclusively is the political part of the budget process. That is the final 40 days when the legislature has to take not one but two $10 billion budgets, a supplemental budget which amends the current fiscal year and a new budget. And within a period of 40 days, they have to try to comprehend, ponder, debate, change, understand, and finally pass both of those pieces of legislation. And speaking from experience as one who spent all year long dealing with the budgets, it's very complex, it's very difficult to comprehend what's in the state budget. I can only sympathize with legislators who come to the Capitol, spend 40 days trying to deal with the budget. It must be frustrating at times. What is a balanced budget? I was listening to some of the debate in Washington about the balanced budget amendment a few months ago, And I think they have a different vocabulary up there than we do. They talk about spending cuts. What they really mean are not cuts to the actual dollars spent last year, but up there a spending cut means a cut to the spending that they thought they might have to do next year, or the cut to the spending proposal for next year, which is far and away above this year. So a spending cut really isn't a spending cut. In Washington, it's possible to have a spending cut, but to spend more money than did last year. That's a little confusing. Another Washington word game I enjoy is the difference between an authorization bill and an appropriation bill. You hear this agonizing debate like the crime bill. They passed a crime bill. Well, the crime bill didn't appropriate any funds. That was an authorization. The funds aren't there. I think the funding for the crime bill has to come from some future savings in some other programs. And the whole idea of these 100 policemen, or 100,000 policemen, I've heard so many versions about what that really means. One version I heard Newt Gingrich talking about is that's really 20,000 new policemen each year for 5 years. That's how they got to the 100,000. Another version, which I think this is true, is that they didn't really fund all those policemen. They funded $15,000 per year per policeman. Well, if you think about it, it takes about $50,000 to put a cop on a beat. Salary, support, services, all that. So I don't know what they funded. Well, actually, I know what they funded. They didn't fund anything. They authorized so-called 100,000 police for the country, but I don't know if it's 5 years, 1 year, short-funded. State and local governments have to match it. So nobody knows what you got. And of course, we all know that if Congress just simply can't manage to pass a budget for the new fiscal year, they pass what they call a continuing resolution, which means that you just keep spending what you're spending now until they get around to passing a new budget. Well, I think that's part of the confusion. The states don't have those kind of problems. Back to the definition of a balanced budget, I heard one commentary talking about the idea that a balanced budget in Washington would be a good thing because all of the states have balanced budget and it seems to work for them. Well, the media response to that was, well, states don't really have balanced budgets because they have all this debt. States collectively have almost $400 billion in debt, and therefore their budgets aren't balanced. Well, that brings up an interesting question. What is a balanced budget? And does any borrowing, no matter how small, mean that your budget is not balanced? If you have a mortgage on your home, or a car loan, or even credit card debt, does that mean that your household budget is not balanced? There might not be agreement on this. In Georgia, we've always had state borrowing and state debt, although it was not technically authorized under the Constitution until 1972, when GO bonds were authorized. Also in 1972, in that constitutional amendment, the annual amount that could be appropriated toward debt service was capped at 10% of the previous year's revenue collections. To my recollection, that 10% limit has never been approached. I don't know what's happened in the past 2 or 3 years. I think Steve's going to talk about this past year, but as I recall, the closest we ever got was in the 6.5% to 7.5% range. So that is an absolute cap on state borrowing by constitutional law. Also coupled with that constitutional limit on borrowing is an annual capital budget, which they don't have in Washington. We have an annual capital budget which itemizes the debt service appropriation for previous borrowings as well as for new projects proposed for debt financing. In my view, these requirements, absolute ceiling on borrowing, a capital budget, make a strong case that Georgia has a balanced budget. As a federal taxpayer, I wish I could make a similar statement for our national budget. Finally, let me make some comments on what I call the changing focus of our state government. And I'd like to go back 20 years. I've picked 20 years because I think that's a good time frame to go back and view. And to sort of lend credence to the 20-year snapshot, I'd like to read a quote from the President of the United States. And this is the quote: "Each generation has a right to choose for itself the form of government it believes most promotive of its own happiness. And a solemn opportunity of doing this every 19 or 20 years should be provided by the Constitution." That's a quote from the President. But you might have guessed it's not the current President, not even his predecessor, nobody in this century. That was from Thomas Jefferson in 1816. Going back 20 years, in 1974, and I'm going to use the 1974-1994 time frame. In 1974, the entire state budget for the state of Georgia was $1.7 billion. $1.7 billion. This includes all funding for the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch of government. Those programs we had back then were, with some exceptions, the same fundamental collection of programs we have today, with few additions. What is not the same today is the cost of operating our state government. What cost $1.7 billion in 1974 cost $9.1 billion 20 years later in 1994, an increase of $7.4 billion or 435%. In deference to Dr. Buell, this increase in spending outstrips any index that might be used to justify it. Population, cost of living, consumer prices, per capita incomes. But perhaps most surprising of all is that state spending has gone up by 33% in just the past 3 years, from $7.4 billion in 1992 to $9.8 billion in 1995, and I think next year's budget is $10.7 billion. This is an annual increase of more than $2 billion. That's more than the entire state budget 20 years ago. The situation for public employment is similar to spending. My years are a little bit different because I couldn't find 1974 to 1994. But state and local government employment in Georgia from 1970 to 1990 as a percentage, excuse me, not a percentage, state and local government employment per 10,000 population, okay? So we're not talking about just increases. We're talking about increases per population. Went up by 36% from 1970 to 1990. From 432 per 10,000 population to 590 in 1990 and then 588 in 1992, 36%. Not only are the number of public employees growing with the population, they're growing faster than the population. Nationally, it's the same thing. All public employment in the country per 10,000 or 100,000 population increased from 1972 to 1992 by 45%. Not in absolute numbers, as an index to population. Government has become an employment program in this country. And to say that our spending is under control and okay because it does not exceed the national average or it's not higher than California or New York, that's not very comforting. I think as a nation, our government has become an employment program. All right, finally, let me talk about a shift in state spending over the past 20 years. Hidden within the overall spending increase has been what I consider some sort of gradual trends that I didn't notice until I went back and looked at them. The largest increases in state spending as a percentage of the total budget over the past 20 years have been in 3 programs: welfare, which includes AFDC and food stamps; indigent health care, including Medicaid and Medicare; and prisons. Indigent health care, prisons, welfare. Not exactly the infrastructure investments that Dr. Ball was talking about, justifying our tax rates. Those programs increased collectively over 60% as a percentage of the state budget. Massive spending was spent on education throughout the 20 years, massive spending. But as a percentage of the state budget, education has stayed around 51%, between 50 and 52%. Receiving less emphasis are the programs that I would consider the ones that promote employment, investment, economic growth, and other quality of life factors. These programs over the past 20 years have declined as a percentage of state spending. Agriculture down 60%, forestry down 30%, industry and trade, economic development programs, down 39%, natural resources, which includes environmental protection, recreational programs, down 69%, transportation, down 65%, our university system, down 23%. The last two in particular are disturbing. Transportation and our university system are sort of the basis for our economic development programs. The message this conveys, I think, is clear, and that is that the role and mission of state government are changing. And they're part of a broader transition toward a social and economic stratification. And as we enter and approach the next century, I think the challenges we face are clear. One is containing the growth of state government spending, and number two is facing the challenge of this economic stratification. Thank you.